Good morning, everyone. It's fantastic to see you here at the Upswell Conference. And we're excited today to talk to you about something that we're all incredibly concerned about, how racial justice philanthropy can fund frontline communities that win. We're really concerned, we all know, about the state of our democracy right now. And those of us who are on this panel came together a year ago to form the Democracy Frontlines Fund. And we'll be talking with you a little bit about that. But each individual organization has also got efforts that they are running on their own front to really try to focus on how we bring racial justice into the center, which we know has to be in the center if we're actually going to repair the frayed edges of our democracy. I am Crystal Haling. I'm the executive director of the Libra Foundation, which is a family foundation based here in San Francisco. Many times people say to me, family philanthropy is very unusual to be at the center of trying to fight for racial justice. But we actually think that that's one of the things that makes the Democracy Frontlines Fund so interesting, is that we do in fact have family philanthropies that are beginning these conversations and are joining in this discussion, in this work. I hail from Florida, which is where I grew up. I'm the child of civil rights activists and a middle school teacher. I am the kind of person who came into this work knowing that this was what I wanted to do from the very beginning. I've worked in nonprofits and philanthropy for 30 plus years. It's been my entire career, and always in some way, shape, or form fighting for justice and equity. I am joined by people who have also been lifelong fighters. I'd like to introduce each of the folks that are here, but first let's get a feeling for who's in the room. If you don't mind, we'd actually have like a quick little poll we'd like you to take, just so we get a sense of who's here today. Can we have the who's in the room with us question that you can answer pop up on the screen, and have folks just give us some sense of where you come from and who you are, so we can get a little bit of a better feeling than we normally have in just the normal Zoom environment. While we're doing that, I'm going to ask each of the folks here to introduce themselves, and we are joined by an incredible panel. So we have first Julia Beatty, who leads the Black-led Movement Fund at Borealis Philanthropy, an incredibly exciting, pooled, community-driven fund that you'll be hearing more about. And Julia has been extraordinary in terms of both her leadership in helping us design and select the grantees for the Democracy Frontlines Fund, but they're also doing incredible work really building the infrastructure of Black-led movement. Also, Alexis Anderson-Reed, CEO of State Voices, which is an organization that is helping us to understand how do we, from the ground up, support the movements of democracy in states around the United States. And then we also have Joe Sciortino, who is the executive director of the Schmidt Family Foundation. And Joe has the distinction of being the very first foundation to join the Libra Foundation in the Democracy Frontlines Fund. But first of all, as we were saying, in that sense of just trying to get a sense of who we are, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, starting with Julia, to kind of tell me, who are your people, which is the way we say it in the South. Give me a little bit about Julia.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia Beatty. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And my people are many. My people are folks who are born and raised in New Jersey. I am a diehard Jersey girl, even though I haven't lived there many years. Jersey girl till I die. My people are also public sector employees. I'm a daughter of a teacher. I'm also the daughter of community activists. My people are Black LGBTQ folks that I have an opportunity to organize with and spend volunteer capacity. My people are also social justice funders, people who are working in philanthropy to try to redirect resources to the movements that are transforming the material conditions of marginalized people in this country. And my people are all of you. I'm just really eager to be in this conversation with like minds who are thinking about how we can continue to work hard to strengthen our democracy so that we all can thrive.
Great, wonderful. Alexis, who are your people?
Yes, thank you, Crystal. And so happy to be here today and just learn from and be able to have this conversation alongside Crystal and Julia and Joe. So looking forward to this. As Crystal said, my name is Alexis Anderson Reed. I use she, her pronouns. And my people are Black folks, all Black people, right? A community and people who are proud, and we live with the contradictions, right, of strength and joy and tradition and oppression and struggle and hope. My people are hardworking and proud Midwesterners. I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And, you know, folks who built a life there, like my grandmother is one who was a German-Irish immigrant who lived on a farm in Iowa. And then she was disowned by her family for marrying a Black man in the 1940s. My other grandmother who came to Chicago from Memphis at 19 during the Great Migration. And then my people are freedom fighters, right? Truth tellers, folks who are dedicating their life to social justice, to movement and an ideal that really something is bigger than ourselves. And so happy to be in this community.
And finally, Joe, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit about you and how you come to be here?
Sure. I love learning about my panelists already on this introduction. This is, I could listen to your stories all day. I was raised in Queens, New York, so right across the water, Julia. Lots of respect for our Jersey neighbors. My people are Sicilians, the good kind though, the pizza makers, not the widow makers. My parents were born in Sicily, moved to America. The immigration story that everybody's familiar with, super hardworking blue collar folk. My first job was a cashier. I was in a union. The union saved my job because the nasty owner wanted to fire me for mispricing a tomato. So, you know, I have a lot of respect for working your way up like that, the way my parents did, and gave me the opportunity to move to San Francisco and, you know, start this career on environmental stewardship that has led me today to the Democracy Frontlines Fund and a colleague of Crystal. So happy to be here and really proud to be on this panel with the three.
Great. Thank you all so much. And thank you for agreeing to be here. And we're so excited to be in this conversation. Let me just start things off by describing what the Democracy Frontlines Fund is. But that is really just kind of the container for our conversation and how we decided to come together for this conversation. But we really do want to spread out a little bit as well and talk a little bit more about kind of the core of the question of our democracy in total. While I am just giving you that brief overview, we're going to ask a little slightly saucy question here. Do we have a fair democracy in the United States of America? So that's going to pop up. That little polling question is going to pop up. By the way, the interesting thing about who's here is that we're 66%, almost 67% nonprofit folks and 33% in philanthropy, which is I think actually that's kind of the secret sauce of Upswell and you know, this whole group is that we actually are pulling together for the first time or one of the rare times. Sometimes we're nonprofits over here and philanthropy over here. So it's really great to be together in this conversation. But go ahead and take a look at that poll while we're chatting. So Democracy Frontlines Fund. 1 year ago today, as a nation, we watched a horror. We shared in a trauma of watching a police officer kill an unarmed Black man. I started receiving phone calls from people, and I myself was very concerned about something happening that I had seen happen before in philanthropy. Something horrible happens, particularly racially based, and we form a commission. We create a committee. We fund a study. All of those things tend to extend the conversation and delay action. And what we really wanted to see was for all of us to actually act quickly in response, because we know that in the movement, in the action, in taking action right away, we would both be committing ourselves to repair, which had to happen, and we all knew that. And we would be committing ourselves to being part of a learning journey. Because some of us who are at the table with the Democracy Frontlines Fund were shocked by what happened to George Floyd. Some of us at the table, particularly those in the Brain Trust who helped us to form the Democracy Frontlines Fund, were shook to the core, but we were not shocked. So how can those folks who have perhaps because of privilege, because of whiteness, because of where they sit in the hierarchy of the food system of philanthropy and nonprofits, perhaps have a narrower view than they think, open the aperture so that we could understand the issues more deeply? And that is exactly what we did by creating the Democracy Frontlines Fund. We moved money immediately from the time we started the fund and began having those conversations at the end of June of last year. We moved checks of $12 million to 10 organizations by October. We had a commitment from 12 foundations to fund $3 million each year, so $36 million total for the fund. And the commitment was to join in together to learn about Black-led organizing and support it, to specifically fight against voter suppression, and specifically support organizations who are rallying the cry around defunding prisons and police, recognizing that first and foremost for Black people to be fully part of this democracy, police have to stop killing us. So we came together, even though all of those foundations would not have said that that particular charge was in their mission statement, but saying that we wanted to come together to support the work that is happening and to learn together. And that is exactly what we've been doing. We have quarterly conversations with our grantee partners. We are studying and reading together, and we are beginning to understand some of these issues that we don't necessarily talk about in polite company and philanthropy. And that is just the beginning. We're just getting started. Now, I want to turn, that's my perspective about how we started the Democracy Frontlines Fund, but these are my partners. They are not always in lockstep with me, and they have a different perspective. So let's jump into that. Julia, I would love it if you run the Black-led Movement Fund. I got to believe that you were thinking to yourself a year ago, something a little different than what I was thinking a year ago. Maybe the rest of the world is waking up to where you are, but can you talk a little bit about how the events of 2020 impacted you, your organization, and how are we doing 1 year later? But let's start with, how did it impact you from the events of last year?
Thanks, Crystal. Thank you all to my panelists. I'm really excited to be here for this conversation. 2020 was a banner year. What we witnessed in this last year was one of the largest social movements in US history that was driven by Black organizers, many of whom had been building infrastructure, base building, engaging community, doing political education, engaging in the political clarity needed to shape policy agendas and to move policy to transform systems, particularly around policing. And so, what we witnessed last year was a significant uprising, many uprisings, but that they were, not even the culmination, but they were rooted in real organization building that had been happening for years, frankly, for 400 years, right? Black folks have been the cornerstone of democracy organizing since we were brought here in bondage, right? Struggling for literal freedom, right? And so that liberation struggle continues. And the Black-led Movement Fund has actually been resourcing Black-led organizations, particularly those that are active with the movement for Black lives, since the Ferguson uprisings in 2015. So what we were able to see last year was incredible momentum that enabled organizers, a lot of the folks that we've been supporting for many years, to show up for racial justice and to call for divestment in policing in stronger and more powerful ways. Folks had some real accomplishments. We're able to really harness this momentum to extract over $840 million from police departments all over the country. Organizers were able to secure investments of at least $160 million into communities, right? So when we talk about invest, divest, it's about investing in the kind of community supports that keep people safe and divesting from the policing that has traditionally done harm to Black people. And also organizers are able to get police out of schools in a lot of communities, and in about 25 cities that actually saved $14 million in resources. So this is a really incredible year. But what it has also meant is that a lot of the movements and organizations that we're supporting are now facing a significant backlash from the state legislature, from police associations, and white supremacist groups who do not want to abandon or change the status quo. So, the events of last year have also impacted us, because I think we realize that we need to step up to do more to be able to support our organizations that are not only at such a critical turning point around being able to really move forward some of the transformation that they've been long, building towards, but also to flank our grantees and the folks that we're investing in because they're highly visible and under attack. For example, we're seeing the criminalization of not only protest, but the criminalization of the invest and divest work that has been successful in communities. So in Florida, right, HB1 passed, which criminalizes folks from it triggers a state investigation when $1 is moved from a local police department from a local budget out of policing into anything else. We're seeing in places like Oklahoma, right, that now you can run over a protester and not face any real consequences. So our First Amendment rights to be able to protest are being impacted as well too. So while we're seeing incredible victories taking place across the country, we're also seeing significant backlash. And so it's something that we're holding both of those things, as sort of the hope around that and the optimism, but also the real responsibility and the commitment that is needed for us as funders to continue to show up for our organizations for the long haul, not just to fund the work when it's highly visible in the news, but to continue to support these organizations through the implementation work that they're doing, and to also be able to counter the backlash that they're also facing.
Thank you so much, Julia. Incredible work. Thank you. Alexis, hand in glove with the conversation about Black-led movement work, organizing, defund, is the question of voting rights and the attacks that we have seen against those. You really work at the heart of this question of our ability to engage in democracy. So tell us a bit about State Voices, and also tell us, how did the events of 2020 impact you and your organization in the work that you're doing around voting?
Yeah, definitely. So State Voices is a network of 23 tables. And so tables are like permanent coalitions, like infrastructure that are there every single day in community. We work with over 1,200 organizations that work together on the ground. And we work year round to make sure people are having a voice on the issues that are impacting their lives every single day. And we're working toward building a vision of a multiracial democracy where everyone can thrive and everyone can live in their full dignity. And we all know that 2020 democracy was under attack. It was a hard year. I mean, I know that's an understatement. Everyone was experiencing it. But it was an especially hard year for organizations who were doing civic engagement work, who were doing democracy work, who were doing social justice, racial justice work. It was a hard year, not only for the organizations, but especially for the people who were doing this work. It was hard for the people that we were working every single day in the community to engage. And something that I think that we really learned was that we have to meet people's basic needs before we can engage them on civic engagement. So you're seeing a lot of so before we're registering people to vote or having folks take action around an issue that's impacting them, if folks don't have connections to healthcare or PPE supplies, right? If we saw, natural disasters happening last year, folks that don't have, food and resources, they're not going to be able to engage on, in a way that's connected to kind of what's happening in the political environment and be able to take action. And so you're seeing a lot of civic engagement organizations who did not have to think about that kind of the service or meeting the needs of communities have to shift a lot of their strategies in order to do that. And then 2020 was hard on me. It was hard on me, I mean, as a person living in this world, but as a leader of an organization, and I'm part of a new executive directors of color cohort, and just the leaders across this country who just so much was on folks' shoulders, and we're expected to shift strategy and have this huge impact during an election, but we also had to take care of ourselves and our people. It was a lot, and organizations and leaders are being asked to do more and more and more and more, also with the stakes being so high. But with that, I'm so proud of what State Voices and all of our partners and network accomplished last year. We saw the highest voter turnout in our lifetime. Our network made over 228 million voter contacts, registered more than 2 million voters, protected voters at the polls when they were being threatened by white supremacists. We provided new data and tech tools because we had to shift to a all virtual, environment. And so we had to get new text messaging tools and vote by mail tools. And so we trained over 5,000 leaders in how to use this new technology. We moved money directly to organizations on the ground, close to 10 million and $1 million for Native and Indigenous organizations. We supported the Georgia runoff, and we made close to 19 million contacts in just a month. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is just how our organizations, showed up and took care of our people and took care of one another. We went to a 4-day work week. We made a commitment to keep on all of our canvassers, made sure they had healthcare, made sure they had the technology. We gave monthly at-home stipends so they had what they need to work from home. We talked about mental health openly, provided resources. We did wellness programs. And so I really think that what 2020 taught our movement and should have taught our nonprofit progressive ecosystem is that we can take care of our people. We can take care of one another. We can build organizations that are built on the values of liberation and love, and that are countering white supremacist culture, right? While at the same time having this huge programmatic impact. Both can be done, and we just have to be a reflection of our values. And the last thing I'll say is another important lesson of 2020 is something that I always repeat, and it's kind of like a motto at State Voices. It's something Alicia Garza says, is that voting will not bring us liberation. Rather, voting and elections are an important litmus test of our organizing and our demonstration of power. And so it's no accident that we saw the largest voter turnout in our lifetime. We saw this huge increase of first-time voters, especially with young people and the Black and Brown folks compared to previous elections. At a time, we were also seeing the largest racial justice uprisings in a generation, and where there was a referendum on white supremacy at the top of the ticket. People were feeling on this deep, visceral and emotional level, the attacks on our democracy and what that means for their lives. And civic engagement work, yes, is not only about voting, but rather it must be done in this year-round organizing model that centers Black folks, that centers BIPOC community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It also is, you raise such important points about the nature of the nonprofit ecosystem. And I should say that we're trying to meet that with the Democracy Frontlines Fund. The funds were general operating support dollars. It's a 3-year grant, and we really were encouraging folks to use it as they saw best. And the leaders like Alexis who said, yes, and we're going to do this work and we're going to take care of our people. Really important, and an important learning and lesson for us as funders and partners together. Thank you so much, Alexis. Joe, this is, I'm really curious as to why when I called you and you picked up the phone and I said, I have this crazy idea, maybe there's something we could be doing together. And you said, yes. And I said, oh, okay, all right. Tell me a little bit about that, because I wasn't really expecting it. And it certainly provided, it was really so important in the creation of this effort to get that first affirmation. And I just want to jump in with 1 second and say that in answer to our question, 100% of you have said, no, we don't have a fair democracy in the United States, but there are a lot of you here today. So like us, like with the Democracy Frontlines Fund, I think that that recognition is not defeat, it is fuel for the work that we are doing. And I love that that is how we are entering into the spirit of this conversation. Joe, you were some fuel to the work that we've been doing, but tell us a little bit about your work and how the events of 2020 affected you and your organization.
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Crystal, for a great lead, and thank you, Alexis and Julia. You've triggered a bunch of things and points that I hadn't thought of that I'll try to weave in here. And Alexis, you really took me back to like April and May of 2020 and what emotional state we were all in. We were reeling from COVID, right? It was month 2 of the shutdown, and what our Schmidt Family Foundation had tried to do was do some rapid response grant making into communities that were being hit especially hard. So, we work on food and energy issues in the United States. We work on environmental justice within those systems. So we try to get, funding to farm worker groups that could translate, COVID instructions into other languages to help them. We tried getting some PPE equipment to Navajo Nation to make sure that that community was well equipped. So we were kind of reeling from all that activity. And then, as Crystal said in the intro, George Floyd was murdered in May. And, our staff was just tissue thin, and everything just ripped, and just everyone went into meltdown mode, myself included, I think, as you said, Alexis. And it was hard. It was hard watching that. It was hard watching my staff watch that and see what they went through. So, as you said, Crystal, we didn't want to do another report. We didn't want to do a statement that felt empty in the moment. And it felt like we should step up and do something more. And we had been trying to center racial justice in our food and energy work for about 5 or 6 years. So we had somewhat of an entry point and said, okay, we understand communities need to be empowered and have self-determination. So how can we figure some way to help this moment and step into this in a really thoughtful way? So Crystal, when you and I talked, we were sort of primed and wanting to do something instead of just an empty statement. And, as you're such an excellent community organizer, out of your top drawer, you said, I've got this idea. It's called the Democracy Frontlines Fund. I need some help. Can you sign on? So I went to our board and I said, board, we do environmental justice work, right? And we ask communities of color across the country to raise their voices for clean air, clean water, healthy food. But those voices are being systematically silenced by the state with a deeply unfair criminal justice system, an increasingly restrictive voting system and election system. So how can we ask those same voices to be loud and open in environmental work when they're being silenced? And so we have an opportunity to support those communities in some way. That I think is really complementary to the work we do and also just authentic and meaningful. But here's the kick. We don't know where the money's going to go. So there's a brain trust led by Black women that's going to decide who these groups are, and the funding's going to go out the door and we're not sure where it's going to land. That's called trust-based philanthropy. How does that feel? And I used the word that I think, Crystal, you put in the memo, was said, we're going to disrupt philanthropy. That turned heads on the board because we're steeped in Silicon Valley ethos, right? Disrupt has a whole bunch of negative connotations. If we disrupt one more sector, I'm going to lose my mind. But in this context, we want to disrupt how philanthropy works. It's not a winners take all mentality. It's a support communities and be community centered, not foundation centered. They love that. And they said, we're in 3-year general operating support to these organizations, and let's just do it. So we signed on pretty quickly. You're right, Crystal. We were, I guess, the first foundation to join in. And that sounds radical to do community-centered versus funder-centered, but I hope it gets less radical over time. And I hope that this DFF coalition kind of has lit a little bit of a path to show how it's actually not that radical. And then I'll just end with, a whisper off stage to other executive directors of foundations. Like, this is your moment, right? Like, we have cushy jobs. It's nice. I'm sitting, marinating in privilege all day long. Wow, this was a moment where I had to step up and put some political capital on the line. And I took it. I said, yeah, this is it. I've got to cash it in. Those moments don't come along that often. I'll usually do a office seating chart or a benefits plan or like all this other stuff that keeps me busy. Wow, this got the blood pumping in a really vital way. And I tried stepping in and stepping up to the moment. And I just want to thank Crystal for sort of giving me, as you said, the fuel to kind of make sure that I had the courage to do that and approach the board in that way.
Thank you so much, Joe. Beautiful. Thank you. So powerful. One of the things that we absolutely are tackling with the Democracy Frontlines Fund too is this challenge of what it is for foundations, for philanthropy, to fund movement work. So Julia, I really would love it if you would talk a little bit about, and let me just start by just saying one thing, which is sometimes people will say there's kind of, like funding movement stuff is important. It's the only thing. Funding services is like that, that's so 20th century or whatever. That is not where we're coming from. And I think Alexis put that issue to rest too, when she talked about the hand in glove nature of that. But I do think that more foundations are comfortable looking at units of service provided when they're looking at grant making. It does tend to lead a little bit to that programmatic love, where I'm funding a program and I know exactly what I'm funding. Talk to us a little bit about how you think about what philanthropy needs to change and do differently in order to be in right relationship and good partners in funding movement work, because it's a different beast. So tell us a little bit about that, Julia, since that's what you do all the time.
Sure. Thanks, Crystal. I think first and foremost, one of the things that I'm constantly trying to impart, onto the funding community is an understanding that investing in Black organizing work, specifically, right, in Black-led movement work, is actually what is going to help us all get free, right? It is, I mentioned earlier, right, it's the tide that lifts all of our boats, and it is, Black folks and Black organizers for centuries that have been organizing on behalf of this democratic project that is the United States, right? So history teaches us that when we invest and that when Black folks are organized and are winning victories, that actually everyone benefits. And so I know we're living in a pretty ahistorical time, but to share a little bit, just a concrete example, right? If we look back to to the end of the Civil War, so during 1865 and 1866, you had Southern state legislatures that were, replacing slavery with basically some other name, right? They were Black codes that served to severely limit the economic rights and social mobility of Black people. It maintained a racist social system in this country by restricting folks' ability to work, to speak freely, to own property, to travel, right? It's sort of the beginning of our carceral state began to emerge at this time. So in 1865, it was Black leaders that began to organize conventions and essentially like town halls to organize community around this idea for equal rights and access to employment and land. And so it was thanks to this organizing that in 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, right? And this was an amendment that granted citizenship to all people, not just Black people, but all people born in this country or naturalized in this country, and specifically guaranteeing all citizens equal protection of the law, right? So that's just like a concrete example of like how Black organizing has actually contributed to freedoms and liberties for all people. So, of course, I just feel really strongly that, philanthropy has not really done enough to invest in Black folks and Black-led organizations and formations. They've been under-resourced in our sector, for a very long time. And in fact, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity just came out with a report saying that despite what we've been hearing about a significant and historical investment in Black organizing in 2020, actually a lot of those pledges didn't necessarily come through, right? So there's some real accountability that has to happen. But another reason why I just feel like this work is so critically important, I just really encourage all of us to think about how we are partnering with these incredible movement organizations, either through resourcing. I know we have a lot of nonprofit colleagues on this call. I would encourage them to get familiar with the Movement for Black Lives and the many coalition efforts that have emerged from that ecosystem. But the movement is also producing wins in strategic areas, right? That actually have a really powerful impact for all of us. Alexis mentioned the mutual aid work, right? Actually having to meet folks' material needs, that the ways in which Black organizers are doing service provision as well, right? This is some of the most intersectional work you can fund as far as issue and strategies. The amount of folks that have been mobilized in the last year across multiple movements. I mean, these are Black folk and BIPOC folk, also white allies who are not only getting politicized around racial justice in this moment, but now that is sort of connecting them to other movements around environmental justice. I'm thinking about the folks on the Gulf Coast who are organizing around the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, which is a climate change campaign that really centers the experiences and solutions of Black and also Indigenous people in the Gulf Coast who have been disproportionately impacted by climate change. And, you know, narrative change, right? The way that we're even talking about Black Lives Matter in this current cultural moment is just, and centering, you know, experiences of Black people is, for me, feels very new. I've been around a little while. I haven't been around that long, but I've been around a little while. This feels new to me. But again, as I mentioned earlier, right, we're seeing significant policy shifts. You know, budgets are being considered in different ways. You know, what Alexis was sharing around the civic engagement work that they've been doing is incredible, right? The ways that folks have been mobilized. So I just feel like we're such an incredible moment where there's so much opportunity and there's so much potential. And all that really is required of us as funders, right? Who, I agree, Joe, we have pretty cushy jobs. It's a pretty privileged position to be able to determine who gets resourced, right? And, you know, like, this is a credible opportunity to be able to just move, you know, even some of the, you know, I've seen a number of private foundations thinking about, you know, moving more than the 5% that they're required to by the IRS every year to, you know, to increase the pie of resources and making very explicit commitments to fund to fund Black organizing. So I'm excited about this moment. I think that there is such an imperative for all of us to get on board, and there's an entry point for us all, whether or not you're funding Black folks specifically. If you are funding democracy work or care about democracy, then you have to have this lens and have to be thinking about how you're working in right relationship and real partnership with Black people and Black movements.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Julia. So profound and so true. And I love the way that you draw the through line from the times of slavery to now in terms of seeing the same kinds of, you know, what is it that Isabel Wilkerson says, you know, slavery didn't end, it just morphed, you know, it just sort of changed, transmuted into something else, whether it was Jim Crow. And now we're really seeing that. In Georgia now, the governor has made it a misdemeanor to accept a bottle of water if you're standing online waiting to vote. And we know that people stood online for 10 and 11 hours waiting to vote in 2020. We know that it is now also a misdemeanor if you offer someone a bottle of water who is standing online. So the idea that, you know, and this is very much designed, as we know, to really thwart those who came out and are expressing the importance of this democracy, which is a lot of young voters, a lot of Black and brown voters, a lot of Indigenous voters. We saw an incredible upswell in Indigenous voting, with some funders putting resources directly into the hands of those communities, which has been fantastic. Alexis, I'm hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about what else, tell us a little bit about what you would like to say to your other funders in terms of the work that you're doing. Because sometimes I think it's hard for people to understand organizing work the way you do it, which is very tied to democracy. But I think it's hard for them to understand, like, in an off year, shall we say, because democracy funders tend to fund in election cycles. You know, what do you want them to know about the work that you're doing in the incredible, you know, at the 23 tables, 1,200 organizations? How do they wrap their mind around it? How do they think about the work that you're doing differently?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think that why invest in Black-led frontline work, why invest in organizations who are doing this work on the ground every single day, is because everything that we are seeing, from the attacks on immigration to rampant voter suppression, the erosion of our democracy, the murder and abuse by law enforcement, is an attack on Black people. And we are seeing this intentional erosion of our democracy. And I always think of what Manuel Pastor says, is that white supremacy is staging a final defense. And at State Voices, we're seeking to build a multiracial democracy that's grounded in building Black political power, that's grounded in building political power for Indigenous, Latinx, API, all people who have been marginalized, who have been oppressed, so that we can all thrive and we can all live in our full dignity. And I think that's so important. And just as what Julia said, is that once Black people are free, we are all free. right? So it's about Black folks, it's about all of us. And so I think it's really important, and we've been thinking about in our network, is what are the conditions to have a robust and multiracial democracy? We need access to the ballot that's easy and fair. We need an educated and engaged electorate and folks who are participating, who are making their voices heard both during elections, but on the issues that are impacting them. We need equal representation. We need people power over money. We need folks who feel safe, who are protected, and we need racial justice that recognizes and repairs how anti-Blackness is built into the fabric of our systems, of our culture and democracy. And so bottom line, racial justice is essential to building a democracy that works for all of us. And so when you're thinking of democracy, you should be thinking of racial justice, right? Racial justice for me is when we can be free of structural racism, where there is repair harm, the repair of the harm caused by white supremacy and anti-Blackness, where race as a social construct doesn't exist, but rather our ethnicity and identity can be celebrated, where Black folks and all people of color and all people can feel joy and love and freedom. And I think that once we understand this, we can understand and work on the policies and the structural game changers that move us toward a vision of racial justice and move us toward a vision of Black liberation. Whether that's defunding the police, reparations, dismantling the Electoral College, the list goes on. And all of these are important game changers for racial justice, but they're also important game changers for a democracy that's going to work for us all. And so, as Julia mentioned, these are issues, right, and ideas that Black folks, Black-led organizations have been working on for years and decades. And it's important to thinking about the cycle, right? It's important to invest in the here and now, and I think that's what we're good at. That's what philanthropy is good at. They're good at understanding election cycles. They're good at investing. Look, 2022 is upon us, the midterm elections. But what is not happening is, and that's, we call it that boom bust cycle. But what's not happening is thinking about how elections are just a tactic and tool, right, towards something that's larger and a larger strategy. And also what's not happening is investing in the long term, right? And investing in, and I think anything that's going to make truly a distance, you're going to have to, it's like a 10-year arc. And so we have to do more of investing in what may feel scary. We have to invest in what may fail and where we're not going to see impact right now. And we, in 2012, after, the tragic murder of Trayvon Martin, a group of Black organizers started the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and a movement was born. And we're seeing almost a decade later, we're feeling and experiencing something different, and this impact the movement has had. And 2020 was this pinnacle moment on how Black Lives Matter permeated our culture and changed policies and practices. There's a lot more to do, but we're seeing something different. But in 2012 and 2013 and 2014 and the years that followed, Black Lives Matter was a tax. It was not invested in. People didn't understand the larger vision and purpose, right? And so what can be invested in now that may seem scary, but could have this huge impact, could be this game changer for Black folks and be a game changer for our democracy? Is it police divestment strategy? Yes. Is it reparations? Yes. This list goes on. And Black folks are on the front lines of this innovation. And so I encourage, what if I had to say anything to philanthropy, yes, invest in the here and now, because people's lives are being impacted, right, in 2021, 2022. But also, I encourage y'all to be courageous, right? And invest your money, time, energy, privilege in what's truly going to make a difference, and trust the Black people, trust Black organizers, trust the Black-led organizations who are on the front lines, because I promise if you give them the money, and one thing I just want to shout out, Democracy Frontlines Fund is the folks who, that Joe said, the Black women made, decided where to put the money, they're the real deal. So put your money in the real deal and I promise you are going to see a difference in the next decade of what it means, not only for Black lives, but what it can mean for all of us as we continue to build a multiracial democracy that we all deserve.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Alexis. And, it is so important that you talk about, this issue of the long term, right? And funding for the long term. I think all of us, my father was a civil rights activist, marched with Martin Luther King Jr. And I think so many of us now imagine that we would have marched with King. We would have been there, right there, because that's the kind of people we are. So the question then we have to ask ourselves is, if we think we would have been that kind of person then, how do we make sure we are being that person right now? And being that person right now is funding groups like the Black-led Movement Fund. It's funding groups like State Voices. It's doing this kind of work now, because it's important to remember that MLK was not beloved during the time that he was doing his work. He was much reviled. He was a very unpopular person, seen as being divisive and too angry at the time that he was doing that work. So we've got to really make sure that we're not whitewashing, rewriting history, and think about how we want our kids to look back and think about us. Because I look back at the work that my dad did with tremendous pride. Alexis and Julia, all of us, Joe, we all talked about our families, the people we come from, with tremendous pride. Let's ensure that we are doing that kind of work, that the next generation looks back at us with that same sense of pride. I also want to talk a little bit about the intersectionality of issues. Certainly, we've talked a bit about that around identity, but issues. One of the grantees of the Democracy Frontlines Fund is the Black Land and Food Justice Alliance. A lot of the funders were a little surprised that organization was in the Democracy Frontlines Fund portfolio. But part of the reason for that was because it was important to understand that the theft of land for Black people and for Indigenous people as well, but this is a Black fund, was specifically part of the strategy of decreasing our ability to participate in democracy. We know that land ownership is an incredibly important part of who gets to vote, because otherwise we wouldn't have a Senate. We also know that Black people have lost something like 70% of our land over the last 3 decades. Through state-sponsored actions, by the way, right? So this has not just been individual, ill actors. This has actually been part of state-structured financing, laws, et cetera. Joe, one of the things you mentioned is that you were particularly interested as an environment funder, as an environmental justice funder, and you all also fund in food. That you have begun to you've been on a journey understanding the centrality of race and racial injustice and anti-Blackness in that work. And how has Democracy Frontlines Fund and all the other work that you've been doing helped you to understand why race is important for environment funders, for food funders, for food system funders? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, that's a meaty one, Crystal. Let me start with one thing and then go back to that. You mentioned King and Alexis mentioned Manuel Pastor, and he does a mashup of the quote where he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, but somebody's got to stand up and pull that sucker down. And I love that sentiment of, it doesn't happen by itself. It happens because of people like Alexis and the groups Julia funds. So, how do you provide the platform to help them stand up and even grab that thing even quicker and pull it down even harder? So I just love being able to kind of reference what both of you just said. You can't not have a racial justice lens once you start opening up your eyes to these issues. And so we had been funding BIPOC-led groups in the environmental space, and you start to understand what's important to communities of color, and it's not just this siloed approach of, oh, we need healthy food, oh, we don't have renewable energy. It's the whole suite of social justice issues, and you can't ignore it. As much as we like to be organized in philanthropy, very siloed, I work on ocean conservation, I work on healthcare. The world doesn't operate like that. And we're trying to be more responsive to it. And I think this Democracy Frontlines Fund helped provide an avenue where we could be more responsive. We're even organized internally into these ad hoc groups. We call them cross-programmatic initiatives. So we pull somebody from each siloed area and they work collectively on an issue like mining and renewable energy, right? Like what's going to happen with our renewable energy transition? Well, we're going to need a lot more minerals and that's going to affect communities. So how do we create a group internally that can address that holistically? We're now putting the Democracy Frontlines Fund work into one of these cross-programmatic groups so that other people in our foundation can learn what's happening with these great 10 groups that we funded, so we can cross-pollinate the learning and help it extend out into these groups that are working on food and energy. So once the doors open, you kind of can't shut it again. And our foundation now has reoriented towards making sure we center racial justice in all our work. And one concrete example, or one, I guess, indicator, we've signed up to the Donors of Color Network Climate Pledge. So they ask the top 40 foundations who work on climate to transparently share their grant making and pledge to giving 30% of their funding to BIPOC-led groups. We signed up, we're one of 4. I know Crystal Libra Foundation has signed up. That's a really interesting mechanism, right? To get some accountability out there in a nice sort of voluntary opt-in way, but it's accountability nonetheless. And Julia, you said, we have cushy jobs. Yeah, because there's no accountability. Our 990 goes out there, nobody really reads it, nobody cares. You can find a whole bunch of interesting information in 990s. But we now have stepped up and said publicly we want to take this pledge. And we're only able to do that because we've focused on these cross-siloed issues, and that racial justice is important in energy and food, and not just in those communities, but across the spectrum. And to your point, Alexis, I've been reading Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, and she talks about the solitary dividend. So, Black-led groups have been talking about this for decades. And I think there's a moment now where everyone's realizing that if we resource Black-led groups, it'll really benefit a lot of people that are hurting and are being treated unfairly. So I like this idea of the solitary dividend, and I think it has some momentum, and it's really speaking to a lot of the things that you were talking about too.
So wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe. It's great. And I love that you're actually, sharing with us some of the meat and the bones of how you're getting out of your silos in your foundation, because it's really, we can say these things sometimes on a panel, and then people are like, well, how do you operationalize that inside the organization? So really appreciate that too. I think we're coming up on time. So we have a couple of questions. I think somebody really highlighted the pre-report, which is looking at the difference between the promises made and the actual funds. I would highly recommend that to folks, and maybe we could pop that into the chat for folks. There was also this question about how are some of these changes playing out in the boardroom. I want to commend one thing to folks. This idea of funding into what some foundations call intermediaries, but I think more and more of us are kind of referring to as community accountable pooled funds, like Democracy Frontlines Fund, like Julia's Black-led Movement Fund, and the whole suite of funds that Borealis Philanthropy funds. There are so many of those organizations. You can find a lot of them. The Libra Foundation funds them. And I really want to encourage any of the funders to think about that, because they are doing donor organizing and donor education as well as doing funding. I say this is really important because a lot of times people ask me, well, what happens in your boardroom? And for me as an executive director, I cannot possibly do all the education for my board members that they need and want to feel good about doing this work. They actually have to start to shift the norm by being in lateral relationship with other board members, right? With other folks of wealth. we need them to be doing that work as well. That's a little bit verboten in philanthropy, but that is absolutely essential because they're doing a lot. My board members are doing a lot of their donor education through the Solidary Network, through the Borealis Fund, through the Groundswell Fund, right? They're getting themselves educated in a different way. And I think that's really, really important for folks to think about as well, because the learnings have to go this way as well as this way, right? So I can't take the credit for having changed my board. My board is in conversations with people who are helping them to become changed. All right, we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to turn things back to this amazing panel to ask each of you to make closing comments. Certainly, it would be great if you can share what makes you hopeful. But I also think if there's any core nuggets of information you want to leave us with, feel free to do that as well. And I'm going to go in reverse order. So Joe, you're first.
Oh, I wasn't ready for the switcheroo. I'll end the way I thought I was going to end. I'll pull together two threads that I've given. The sort of whispering to EDs off stage, and then who are my people? Another group of my people are a fierce group of gay tennis players in San Francisco. So I'm a big tennis fan. So I'll end with a Arthur Ashe quote. True heroism is remarkably sober. It's undramatic. It's not the urge to surpass each other at whatever cost. It is the urge to serve each other at whatever cost. So I leave that for the EDs and leaders of the room to figure out what your heroism moment is. It's not flashy sometimes, but it's important.
Fantastic. So wonderful. Thank you. Alexis.
Thank you. And I hope everybody, I've been over here snapping for Joe and Julie and Crystal. So I hope everybody's giving all the affirmations. So I would say that in 2022, we're up against a lot, right? Violence against queer and trans community, attack on women's bodies, Asian hate, rampant voter suppression, and all of this can feel overwhelming, and it is overwhelming. And we can live in this place of hopelessness and of fear and sadness and anger, which sometimes can lead to apathy. But I've been reflecting a bit on what all of these attacks mean to us. And I was actually talking with a reporter a few weeks ago who wanted me to comment on the hopelessness that people were feeling because of the dozens of voter suppression bills that we're seeing. And I said, I think we have to ask ourselves, why are these attacks happening? And the answer is, it is because we have power. It's because we had the greatest voter turnout in 2020. It's because our communities are organizing and building multiracial movements. It's because communities are feeling on that deep level, the connection between having a strong democracy and things that are impacting them in their communities every single day. And folks would not work against us this hard, and if we did not have power. And so we have to continue to build and strategize and fight back against those who will do anything to see white supremacy prevail. And they're fighting so hard because I know, and I don't know if folks can feel it, but I can feel that we are on the precipice of change. And so that's what brings me hope. And the last thing I'll say is I was having a conversation with Maurice Mitchell, who friend, colleague, director of Working Families Party. We were in conversation last week. And one thing he said to me was, another world is possible, but it's not inevitable. And so my hope is that in the belief that we recognize our collective power and that we can organize and build like that multiracial democracy that works for all of us, and because another world is possible.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Julia, you get the final word.
All right. Oh, wow. Pressure. Just what gives me hope are these kinds of conversations. I just want folks to really be thinking about taking that risk, right? And reframe your idea of what a risk is, right? Because when abolition was being talked about in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, that was extremely radical. And the idea of Black people literally being free was not widely supported, right? And so, I think folks sort of shudder a little bit around talking about abolition or defund, but I really encourage folks to lean in, to dig in, and to really educate yourself. Connect with community partners in your local communities to help you all think about what does safety look like in a world that is free from cages, the carceral state and police, right? And really think about reframing risk, because this work comes at a cost. Black organizers are doing this work at the expense of their mental health and physical health as well. And we need to fund folks like we want them to win, and not just for Black communities, but for all of us.
Thank you all so much. That's exactly it. We will close there with this. And we know that we have the power to win. Thank you all.